Deep Purple in Rock is an amazing little album, lots of fun, very rich sound, can't get enough of it. It's a great, basic, hard rock, heavy metal album, and yet it actually tries seriously to be interesting, listenable music and not just noise and nonsense, if you know what I mean. If it weren't for 1972's Machine Head, I would say that this would be my favourite Deep Purple album. There's also the live album, which is amazing. Here's the thing, Deep Purple, they had a great sound in this Mark II era. Mark III was initially pretty good too, and I feel like they never quite captured that original. They had a lot of attempts to reunite and recapture the sound, and I think the only time they really captured that was with Steve Morse, strangely enough. Perpendicular, Bananas, and Now What, and especially Whoosh is amazing. I'll go into Whoosh a bit later, but Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin have the unfortunate factor of John Bonham's death, and so they weren't able to release any more albums after the 70s. Deep Purple split in the mid-70s, but then they reunited to potentially release... See, it's interesting to see, what does a rock band have to say? This old classic rock band who released great music in the early 70s, what do they have to say? Really great music in the early 70s. What do they have to say in the 80s and 90s to 21st century? Sometimes it's kind of banal and boring, and sometimes it's really interesting stuff. The fans tend to have divided opinions on certain albums. I mean, Deep Purple fans they're an odd bunch. They love this band so much, and honestly, I've always found them to occupy a fascinating place. Let me read something out. Okay, so within the last year or two, I wrote this article here for a zine I was spearheading with some friends of mine known as the Aleph. And I had this section where I'd write about music under the name Brian Oblivion, Brian with a Y, so David Cronenberg doesn't get too annoyed, I suppose. And I had this piece here about the band Deep Purple and their discography. I figure I might read it out here and kind of see how I feel about this now, and we'll read it out, see where I disagree, where I agree, see how it holds up. The article's titled, "I Feel Like Writing About Deep Purple?" It poses a question. I think I'll just have to get these thoughts out of my brain. Forgive the boomer conservatism, I understand that popular music well moved on beyond 1972's conception of heavy metal, although Deep Purple, and their fans, treat that era of post-psychedelic, distorted electric ecstasy, and especially the music of this band itself, as a pure, unpretentious yet substantially classy, justified obsession, an addictive, fulfilling bliss achieved by rocking out to Deep Purple, whatever that entails. Think about it, and forget how uncool it might appear. Imagine being the kind of man whose day is made by a period of it being spent rocking out to Deep Purple. Don't you secretly envy that easy euphoria? I believe I do, or at least I did so initially, when I, being very fond of Led Zeppelin, The Who, Black Sabbath, and generally exciting, charismatically produced 70s-era rock music, realised that Deep Purple, circa 1972's Machine Head, were considered true, authentic, genius heavy metal purity, that initial soup from which the rest of the metal scourge emerged. They seemed, and eventually sounded, to be a middle ground or a bridge between the heavy blues electric bombast of Led Zeppelin and the horrific hammer-like metal innovations of Black Sabbath. Less interested in blues orthodoxy than Page and Plant, although hesitant to take the deep nosedive into heavy metal excess that Ozzy Sabbath pioneered. I, being more attached at that time to the relative innocence of rock in comparison to the subcultural specificity of metal, felt a kinship with Deep Purple, one which might have had potential to surpass my then adoration of Black Sabbath, them being the threshold from whence hard rock transformed truly into heavy metal, splitting the category between beer-drinking simplicity and abrasive, rebellious alienation. Deep Purple, as I later realised, likely held that foothold in whatever classic rock means, as opposed to Black Sabbath or other 1970s acts still considered to be made of metal, such as Judas Priest, Motorhead, possibly UFO, or Ritchie Blackmore's own Rainbow, due to its sound's emphasis on John Lord's glamorous post-Doors organ extravagance. The iconic, blissful and triumphant rock sound achieved by the Mark II lineup, Ian Gillan, Ritchie Blackmore, Roger Glover, John Lord, Ian Pace, is unimaginable without Lord's keys, acting as a persistent sonic bumper, both for the rollicking rhythm section and as a vital counterpoint to Blackmore's needlessly impressive majesty as a rock guitarist. Deep Purple without the organ could just be another heavy, banal, lizard brain, sauropod on amphetamines, loud as possible novelty act, only to be enjoyed in the early 70s or for brief spells of nostalgia afterward. Instead, Lord encouraged Blackmore, directly or indirectly, to actually show off what pure rock music was capable of. Without falling into the excessive ambitions of Yes, ELP, or Genesis, though without deliberately disrespecting them either, Deep Purple Mark II delivered rock songs, and they could play better than anyone else who delivered rock songs. To that snobby, snarky detractor who claimed that Lord had nothing on Wakeman, or pace to sound meager compared to Palmer, one could reply that at least Purple had balls capable of rocking. Who would win in a fight, Ian Gillan or a three-man team of John Anderson, Greg Lake, and Peter Gabriel? You don't know, but you assume Gillan would or could hold his own. What Deep Purple achieved as Mark II, and with the albums In Rock, Fireball, and Machine Head in particular, was a masterly trilogy, or quadrilogy to those who feel that way, of spectacular rock music production, some of the most reverently adored recordings within the rockist canon. The split of Mark II occurred when Gillan and Glover departed, to be replaced by David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes respectively, and has regularly been named, and by members of the band as well, one of the major disgraces in the history of rock music. I mean, not that people don't like Mark II, that Burn is very solid, Stormbringer I actually probably like a little more than Burn even, but just a shame that lineup had to split, especially because they delivered one of the absolute top 5 rock live albums of all time in Made in Japan. That's so genius. I don't think I even mentioned Made in Japan in this article. That's one of the very best things ever released, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinion as well, to be fair. Anyway, on their debut studio release as Mark II, 1970's Deep Purple in Rock, a conscious effort to rip off Jimmy Page's innovations on Led Zeppelin and Led Zeppelin II, both released in 1969, ensured Deep Purple's placement amongst the holy trinity of British heavy metal pioneers, the third being Black Sabbath, if I even had to point this out. This was quadruply enabled with the smash commercial success of 1972's Machine Head, then the band's infamously loud, apparently loudest ever at one time, heavy metal concerts, which set a standard that became legendarily competitive over the next 25-odd years, but most importantly was an unavoidable album track off of Machine Head, a song not originally released as a single, but which had nonetheless received extensive enough radio airplay to ensure the belief that it always had been. Not so. It was in fact in May 1973, over a year after Machine Head's initial release in March of 72, that Smoke on the Water was first issued as a single. This was to capitalize on its already popular status as a rock radio anthem, an aggressively, somewhat defiantly, simplistic rock riff which insists itself the entire 4 or so minutes of the song, the weakest cut on the album, in my opinion, regardless of it being overplayed or not, but that ensured the mass droning adoration of countless rock fans or wannabe rock fans listening to their radios for some rebelliously sonic fantasias. One of the easiest, dumbest melodies to ever be processed by any human ear, and subsequently one of the easiest to learn on a guitar, has unfortunately allowed Deep Purple as a rock band to be, especially through the Abyssian lens of post-millennial pseudo-hindsight, dismissed by a number of individuals as a mildly interesting but historically inferior, even insignificant, one-hit wonder. That likely accounted for their infamous exclusion from the much-maligned Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but not that that matters. I suspect that part of the adoration for Mark II Deep Purple is that it kind of split while it was ahead. After Machine Head comes the much-forgotten, typically dismissed Who Do You Think We Are, which, in my opinion anyway, is a dull, uninteresting series of undesirable blues rock cliches, not extremely enthusiastically performed cliches either, it must be said. Splitting after only one slightly subpar album is apparently equivalent enough to quitting while you're ahead. For all it being a rip-off of Jimmy Page's Led Zeppelin, 1970s Deep Purple in Rock still stands today as a ferociously exhilarating, early, traditional now, heavy metal recording. But why is this? Literally, why is this? What was the catalyst for this truly? Well, if we check the album's credits, the literal answer to that question is the sound engineer Martin Birch. Martin Birch is the real reason why all of our favourite heavy metal albums are our favourite heavy metal albums. Beginning with his outstanding work on Deep Purple's In Rock, he worked with that band up to and including 1975's Blackmore Less Come Taste the Band, before moving on to Blackmore's Rainbow in order to produce the 3 Dio-era studio albums, plus their on-stage live album. Prior to this, and during some of it, he had been an engineer on Fleetwood Mac's Beyond Beautiful masterpiece Then Play On, plus their very underrated set of Kiln House, Bear Trees, Penguin, and Mystery to Me. He had also followed Peter Green out of Fleetwood Mac, acting as an engineer on the even more underrated Green solo album debut, 1970's The End of the Game. In In 1972, he helped engineer the impressive heavy fantasy rock LP Argus from Wishbone Ash. As the 1980s commenced, he presided over the two best Blue Oyster Cult albums, which aren't secret treaties, and then the absolutely phenomenal Dio era of Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, and then at last working as Iron Maiden's exclusive producer from 1981's Killers up to and including 1992's Fear of the Dark. So Martin Birch's quality control spans far and wide and is heavily concentrated on some of the very best hard rock and traditional heavy metal LPs of all time. Were these bands only great because of Martin Birch? Were they great bands made even greater by Martin Birch? Or did Birch know whom had potential and then chose to unlock it? I do not know for certain, for given that particular choice of credit from a group that included the arrogant Richie Blackmore as the catalyst for Deep Purple in rock, I'm inclined to suspect that Martin Birch is the secret genius behind many of our favourite hard rock and traditional heavy metal LPs. I mean, imagine if they weren't produced by him. Actually, no, I do not want to. That all being said, even before Martin Birch, Deep Purple certainly had potential. Shades of Deep Purple is one of the most consistently entertaining, shamelessly happy albums of the psychedelic rock era, and their 1969 self-titled album, third album, is one of its most enjoyably heavy, with some impressive arrangements to boot. After Mark II, Mark III delivered two very solid rock albums in Burn and Stormbringer, at least I think so, although I consider 1975's Come Taste the Band to be a thoroughly uninteresting experience. Mark II reunited for 1984's Perfect Strangers, an essentially glam metal-like aging frost of banal hard rock music, should sound a certain way, fear of experimentation. That album reeks of, okay, what's popular now and what made us popular then? We should just do that rather than what we actually want to do in the studio. Don't get me wrong, I do believe that probably what Deep Purple Mark II reunited inside a recording studio circa 1983/4 might have actually wanted to sound like, would have been similar to, or not alike, Perfect Strangers. I do suspect that what Deep Purple would have wanted to do fundamentally was to compose an album that sounded still like hard rock with some keyboards, some show-offy instrumentation, and an album which doesn't just consist of verse-chorus bullshit. But of course, Perfect Strangers does, because they either felt obligated to, or because they wanted to for commercial reasons, or because they really are just banal hacks at heart, or were by this stage. Or whichever scenario, Perfect Strangers is a crappy album. 1987's The House of Blue Light is a little bit better, but still overall bored. 1990's Slaves and Masters saw Gillan replaced with one Joe Lynn Turner in an attempt to resurrect the commercially friendly second half of Blackmore's Rainbow under the presumably more profitable banner of Deep Purple. Rather than simply reforming the Joe Lynn Turner lineup of Rainbow, Blackmore figured he could have the best of both worlds, a band frontman who agreed with his proposed direction under a band name which attracted notably more album and or ticket purchases. That particular era of Rainbow was a soulless attempt to compose dry AOR hits in order for Richie to pay for his divorce settlements, I assume, and apparently this needed to return, for whatever reason, but without splitting up the cash cow that is/was Deep Purple, though without having to deal with that obnoxious rock cred snob Ian Gillan anymore either. Alas, Slaves and Masters wasn't a commercial smash and is a thoroughly unengaging album on top of that, so it pleases utterly no one. 1993's The Battle Rages On reunited the Mark II lineup yet again, and this ruthlessly, relentlessly 6 out of 10 album is the finest of the 3 post-1970s Mark II reunion releases. That is a bit of a shame, really. Blackmore had enough. He decided that, instead, he really, deep down, wanted to convince his American wife that she could actually sing classical English folk ballads with a degree of authenticity. And so, maybe regrettably, Blackmore's Night came into being with their brand of forced, corporately produced, acoustic, real music, which I have tried in vain to enjoy for almost 10 years now. I don't know how many people actually do. Deep Purple without Richie Blackmore? That's a big no, right? Well, you still have John Lord and Ian Pace, with the fine bass playing of Roger Glover and the lyrics and vocals of Ian Gillan, so maybe Blackmore could be replaced. They had tried with Tommy Bolin on the 1975 album, and that was with an already butchered lineup of Deep Purple. Some folks liked it, though many didn't. So let's keep everyone except Blackmore and then replace Blackmore. Bolin, then? Well, Bolin was dead, obviously, and so they looked to the, in certain guitar-oriented circles, quite legendary, Steve Morse. It could have gone anyway, and I'll celebrate that they tried to stay true to the classic Deep Purple sound, whilst making the music that they wanted to make together as a musical unit. 1996's Perpendicular is, I think, actually a very good album. If one likes Mark II Deep Purple as much as I do, this is a more conscious effort at reproducing its quality sonics, and without vying to be completely unoriginal either, than the actual 3 reunion albums. Strangely, an enjoyable, well-produced series of organ-heavy Purple numbers, Blackmore is ultimately missed, although Morse is thoroughly enjoyed. I tend to think of 1998's Abandon as a step in the wrong direction. Deep Purple tried to sound modern, which at that time meant a group of boomers tactily applying electronic soundscapes and rhythmic novelty to their album's cuts. I don't think it works, to be frank. That was to be Jon Lord's final album with the band. He was to be replaced with the terrific Don Airey. For 2003's Bananas, Purple pulled a real back to basics again, just like with Perpendicular, in order to have Airey well acquainted with their shtick. It worked, I feel, as Bananas is a regularly fun rock release full of rich keys and likeable riffs. A very fine Deep Purple outing. 2005's Raptures of the Deep just felt uninspired, or maybe insecure, or maybe tired, or maybe all three of these things. A bit of a 4 out of 10, if I may say so. Strangely, the large personality that is producer Bob Ezrin managed to wring quite a quality album from Purple in 2013. Now What is another safe attempt to sound like Purple, whilst the band makes sure to have fun. This at least ensures that, aside from being a refreshing return to the Mark II sound, with a unique spin to it, we also receive some satiating contact highs from the band itself. Sadly, they got a bit too lofty with their songwriting arrangements and the production sounded compressed and ugly for 2017's Infinite. Despite Ezrin's presence again, Infinite just really comes across as a rather bad, contemporary, unimaginative attempt at a neo-prog epic thing, but with bad CD age, clustering collision of sound. Yeah, really bizarre. I do not care for it at all. Finally, fortunately, 2020's Whoosh was a return to the quality control displayed on Now What. Rich keyboard sounds, space rock vibrations, playful lyrics, fun drumming, exciting riffing, and multiple absorbing contact highs. I recommend anyone listen to Whoosh. What do we make of this? Now, I happen to like Deep Purple enough that I won't bother with 2021's Turning to Crime. I'd say that piece still reflects my feelings on Deep Purple really quite well.